I am a social scientist, a researcher, or at least I was, and I would always used to describe my work as engaged social science, and I hope by the time I've finished this presentation you'll get a sense of what I actually mean by that. Care has been a theme of much of my work throughout my career. I have been involved in research and action projects involving people who use health and social care services, work with family carers, work with activists in service user movements, with old people and with others. But care is also an important and challenging factor in my personal life, as it is in the life of all or most of us. Even if care is often invisible, it may be taken for granted, it may be relegated to things that are too hard to think about or nothing to do with me parts of our thoughts. So I want to start with some intersections between the professional, the political, and the personal, and the feminists amongst you will recognise the resonances. I want to tell you how I first came across the ethics of care as a way into thinking about how that can help us as we try to better understand care as relational and to develop both the policies and practices that enable us to embody that understanding. So, from the early 1990s, I have been involved in research and practical projects related to the disability movement, movements of people who variously describe themselves as users or survivors of mental health services, and movements of family carers. The experiences of disabled people and mental health service survivors, both in relation to the way in which they were being treated within the health and social care system, and indeed in their lives more generally, were being couched in terms of rights, of justice, and of citizenship. But there were also tensions between these movements of disabled people in particular and the emerging carers movements. And some disabled people rejected the notion of care because their experience of it was that it was oppressive, that it reinforced their identity as people who were needy, who had nothing to contribute, and in some discourses were described as being burdens on others. Rights, not care, became a slogan of some parts of the disability movement. And whilst this sort of way of thinking originated in the disability movement, some of those activists started saying, okay, this is a perspective that's relevant to all people who use health and social care services, including older people. Then my mum, who had appeared very depressed since my father's very early death, started to show signs of dementia and was diagnosed as having dementia. She continued to live at home with regular visits from people who were doing some of the basic stuff about looking after her. She rather reluctantly went to a day centre. She talked often about wanting to die. After a big family party for her 80th birthday, she couldn't remember where she'd had her lunch, where she'd been that day. And I found myself wondering what this stuff I'd been hearing from the disability movement about rights not care meant in relation to my mum. And I found myself thinking, what about good care? I really want my mum to have good care. And around about the same time, I came across this book which is called Citizenship and the Ethics of Care, Feminist Considerations on Justice, Morality and Politics. I saw it lying on a bench at a conference, and I thought, I need that book. The first chapter of that book opens with a description of an everyday scene in a nursing home, where a care worker was schmoozing an old lady. This description of an aspect of everyday life in a nursing home would appear unexceptional to people who are here. But what is exceptional about it was the way in which it opened this book that was called Citizenship and the Ethics of Care. Feminist Considerations on Justice, Morality and Politics. And the author, Selma Savenhuisen, was, when she wrote this, a political theorist and a professor of women's studies in Utrecht. And she used that opening scene to open up questions about what we might think of as good care, the ambivalent feelings that this scene evokes, welcoming the fact that there are people who are willing to offer such care, at the same time as hoping that we're never going to need it. She highlights the fear we have of developing dementia and the significance of the caring presence of workers as we acknowledge how difficult many of us find it to care for our own loved ones. But Selma also draws back from the immediate scene to pose ethical and political questions about the place of care in public debate. These are questions she goes to explore in the book in a range of contexts in relation to care for older people, but also public health more generally, and debates about custody of children. And for me, finding this book enabled me to, it opened up for me a way of thinking about care not as something to be rejected in favour of rights and citizenship and justice, but as necessary to justice in conditions of vulnerability. It opened up a way of thinking about care as universal, as essential to our survival, to our nurturing and development, as essential to thinking about how we live with others, particularly, obviously, about what it might mean to be cared for and to care for others, but also what support we want for others, and to help gain recognition for our humanity in those situations. I discovered this work something over 20 years ago now, and since then I have tried to use it in my own work to reflect back on work that I'd already done, but also to guide me in the way in which I was taking this forward. Okay, so the ethics of care, what is it? And the first thing to say is what it's not. It's not a professional ethics. It's not a code that nurses or other practitioners might follow. There's some dispute as to whether it can be codified. I think it rather loses its force if it does. The origins of the ethics of care lies in the work of a psychologist called Carol Gilligan, who realised the importance of really listening to the way in which children and young people struggle to find a way through the ethical dilemmas that they and others faced in their lives. And her work was in part a response to discovering that very influential theories of moral development had been based entirely in research with boys. And she was rather concerned that there was a sort of absent voice in that work. And she identified, as she listened to children and young people talk about ethical dilemmas, she identified what she referred to as a disconnection and dissociation between what they often felt and what they thought they had been told to feel, and exploring the nature and source of those disconnections, and later how it might be possible to reconnect, formed the core of her work throughout the remainder of her work. And she identified what she called a different voice, which is the name of her key book on this subject. And that different voice is evident in how many young people tried to make sense of the moral choices facing themselves and others. And what she was listening to was the ways in which they couched the dilemmas, not so much about what the outcome was, but how they talked about things. And she heard them talking about the significance of relationships and responsibilities when thinking about what is the right thing to do in complicated situations. And she distinguished an ethic based in relationships and responsibilities from one that was based in rights and rules, which she identified as the ethic of justice. So the ethic of care is a relational ethic, and one that recognises interdependence rather than independence as fundamental to the human condition. Now that idea of a different voice, as I was preparing this, I found myself thinking about a small project that colleagues and I did at the University of Brighton in relation to older people's views of human rights. I had a colleague there who was very interested in human rights, and we decided to gather together a group of older people to ask them what human rights meant to them. And what was interesting is that most of them found it very uncomfortable to talk about individual human rights because they were very aware of the consequences of individual behaviour for others. And that unease that Carol Gilligan had identified amongst young people was there in the voices of older people as well, who were wanting to talk about the significance of relationships with others rather than about how they saw their individual rights. So fundamental to the ethics of care is the recognition that people are relational beings. And that doesn't mean rejecting justice. Many of those who are working in this area, and there has been a huge expansion of both scholarship and practical work using ideas from care ethics. And much of that work has actually been concerned with exploring what are the relationships between care and justice. And the predominant thinking now is that we need care and justice interacting precisely because we are interdependent beings. I'm sure all of you would come up with some sort of statement about what care means to you. This is a definition offered by a woman called Joan Tronto, an American, another political scientist. On the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. In my recent work, I've argued that we need to add a word to this, and that word is together, so that we can live in the world together as well as possible. But this definition, I think, is really important because it invites to think invites us to think about what care is in a rather different way from the ways in which people who do the work of care might want to identify it. So in my presentation so far, I've referred to issues of justice, about the notion of justice in conditions of vulnerability. I've referred to practice issues, the care worker with an elderly lady with dementia in a care home. I've referred to political issues, the notion that disability needs to be thought of in terms of a rights issues, and I've referred to personal issues, such as a daughter thinking about a mother with dementia and how she might be looked after. Care ethics invites us to think about all of those different contexts, and it also requires us to think about the connections between them. It also invites us, and indeed requires us, to think that we are all involved in care. We're all implicated. Caring is a species activity. It's not something that we can relegate or delegate to others and say we have no responsibilities for care. And in a rather nice turn of phrase, Joan Tronto referred to the privileged irresponsibility of those who try to claim that care has nothing to do with them. Usually people who are in powerful positions for whom the care work of others that enable them to do their work is completely invisible. And it also asks us to recognise the more than human world, our environment, as part of the web of care. And that is something that many more people, I think now, in 2021, and not in 1993, when that was written, would actually recognise. And there's some really interesting work being done now on care ethics in relation to work with the soil, work with other animals, and work with the environment. So whilst my starting point was a care worker in a nursing home with an old woman, a care ethics perspective on relational care invites us to think well beyond that familiar context. Joan Tronto has also expanded our understanding of what care involves by distinguishing different stages of care and the values associated with these. So caring starts with caring about something, which involves attentiveness, noticing a need, and noticing a need in the various and particular contexts in which it might be experienced. Care starts with attentiveness. Attentiveness never finishes. It's an ongoing requirement. But the second phase of care is taking what she calls taking care of. Taking responsibility to act on that attentiveness. Care is not just an attitude, a compassionate feeling. It requires action. It requires people who are prepared to do something about it, to take responsibility, to act. The third phase of care is what is perhaps more normally thought of as care, which is the hands-on work of care, which can only really be thought of as caring if it is done with competence. Care is, again, it's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling. It requires people who actually know what they're doing, who know how to do it, who can act competently. But this next one is really, really important. Care is not complete unless we think about the person who is receiving it and how they are responding to the actions. So we can't think only in terms of caregiving. We need to think about care receiving as well. How are people responding? and how can they contribute to learning better how to care. And when she originally set out these phases of care, they finished there. So the last one was care receiving, and Tronto talked about the integrity of care, having got to the point where you can see how people are responding to it. That feeds back into your attentiveness. She later identified another stage, and this is one that is, again, quite distinctive, but I think really, really important, which is this notion of caring with, creating a context and an experience in which people feel they are involved in a process of care. And the value associated with that is solidarity, building solidarity. I now want to bring this into the focus of this event, relational care in old age. If we think about that definition and that way of thinking about care, care ethics invites us to think not only about the interactions between care workers and older people. It also invites us to think about relationships between old people themselves and with those close to them. It invites us to think about the practices that enable workers to feel that they are cared for or not, which is often the case. It invites us to think about the policy decisions and resources that create the overall environment in which care can or cannot be done, and how social care is going to be paid for, is an ongoing debate, and care ethics would have quite a lot to say about it. It invites us to think about the environmental design, the way physical environments are designed, and what that says about the extent to which people feel they are cared for, and also what that environment makes possible in terms of the relationships that can develop within them. It invites us to think about who does the work of care. And that is not only the gender distribution of care labour, but it also invites us to ask difficult questions about the ethics of relying on people who leave their own families in other parts of the world to come to the West to care for old people here. And all those issues, all those areas of interest can and have been considered from an ethic of care perspective. We can also, if we go back to that notion that care is everything that we do, that can enable us to create the conditions in which we can live together in the world as well as possible, we can think about how we do research with care. One of the things that I'm currently working on a book is a book called Researching with Care, where a colleague and I are actually thinking about what applying care ethics to research actually means. Now, I'm here today because Jenny came across my co-authored book on reimagining old age, well-being, care and participation. And so in order to ground what I want to say in this next bit of my presentation, I want to tell you a bit more about that project and some of the things that we learned from it. And the first thing to say about it is that it was a research project that was conducted as a collaboration between university researchers, the local Age UK, and a team of older co-researchers. So it was a participative research project in which older people were not only interviewed, but were interviewers and were involved in the design and the analysis and writing aspects of it. This is some of the team, not all of the team, but some of the team. And here we are actually talking about our experience of researching together. This photo and other photos that will appear come from the filmed learning resources that we produced at the end of the project. I'll say a bit more about that. First of all, I want to talk about three things in relation to this project. First of all, this notion of research itself as something that needs to be done with care. Research as a caring practice, if you like. So if you remember, the first stage of care is caring about something. And so the first thing that the ethics of care asks us to think about is the implications of caring about something and pursuing that through the research that we do. And I suggest that invites us to think about, first of all, what is our relationship to the topic? Why does it matter to us? Why do we care about it? And as I write about this project nowadays, I experience slight sort of discomfort, dissonance. When I undertook this research, I was a senior academic and principal investigator on the project. I had responsibility for it. I'm now retired, and I'm older than some of the people who took part in the research. So when I write about older people in this, I'm thinking, who am I talking about here? Which is an important reminder of the obvious thing that struck us as we were doing this work. A very obvious thing, that older people are our future selves. They're not different people, they're us a few years down the line. But at the same time, we were also aware that some of the older people who we'd invited to research with us, who were our co-researchers, we'd invited them because they were old. And they were actually quite resistant to the notion that they were there because they were old. They were there because, they'd been social care managers in the past, they'd been magistrates, they'd been counsellors, they'd done all sorts of stuff, So this thing about thinking about who we are in the relation to the topic that we are researching and why it matters to us. Us who are differently positioned in relation to the topic and whose position in relation to the topic is going to change is something that's really quite important. But the second point about thinking about research as a caring practice is thinking about what it means to actually apply the phases of care to the research process. And that means those we were researching with as well as those we were researching. So being attentive, actually being attentive to the way in which the older people we had invited to work with us were responding to some of what they were hearing and seeing. Being attentive to the way in which they needed to be supported to enable them to do the work. Being attentive to those things that were in their own lives, happening in their own lives, that were impacting on their experience of their work with us. And we as the people leading, and as we and my colleagues leading the project, taking responsibility for the way in which we set things up and made things happen. to enable people to feel cared for. We had to bring to this our competence, our knowledge, our understanding of how to do research, but we also had to work in a way that was going to enable the people who were working with us to develop their competences, to bring their competences to us, to develop their competence. And one of my favourite moments from this is when Bunty, who is the woman leaning forward at the table there, at a conference when we were talking about our project alongside a number of other academics who were talking about their projects, Bunty stuck her hands up and said, "Tell me about your methodology." So the researcher said a bit more about it. She said, "Well," she said, I wouldn't have done it that way." She said, we decided that wasn't the right way to go about it. I thought, yes, Bunty, yes. Bunty's competence as a researcher, as did grew as she got involved in this project, as did competences in various ways. We built solidarity amongst people of different generations through the process of actually working together. So that sort of understanding of the practice of research as a practice that can be done with care, that can build care in relations, is an example of a sort of practice that you wouldn't think about as care, but actually, there was lots of it going on there. The overall finding was about the centrality of relationships to well-being, no surprise there really. But actually, it enabled us to broaden a concept of relational care in old age. So these sorts of a range of different contexts. Yes, relationships with caregivers, of course. Any number of stories about both positive and negative about the way in which old people were being treated by doctors, day centre workers, whoever else. But also everyday encounters with strangers. Since this project, whenever I go into a supermarket, I will never go to the automatic checkout in that supermarket because of listening to people telling me how important it was to have that face-to-face encounter with somebody who was in the bank or in the supermarket or whatever, because it may well be the only face-to-face encounter they had during the day. So everyday encounters with strangers are important, to think about. Of course, relationships with family and friends. And some interesting and important stuff that came out of that in terms of understanding the difference between help and care. And Grace, who was 97, talked about the very functional help she got from her son in relation to her shopping. Grace she wasn't very mobile, she couldn't get out. So her son would sometimes dash in, do the shopping, bring it back, leave it with her. And she contrasted this with what happened when the son of a friend of hers took her shopping. And this guy made much of her. He always sort of helped her into the car, fitted her seatbelt, took her to the shops and would natter about what was on sale and what do you think about this, what do you think about that, and look at the price of this. It's an entirely different experience, and for her it marked the difference between help and care. But also, and I've talked about the importance of thinking about care receiving, but also caregiving older people as caregivers, and the quite complex negotiations older people were having to get into in order to sustain their capacity and sense of them as themselves as people who were capable of and who were giving care as well as receiving care. Places, being in public, being able to experience being with others, But also, if you couldn't get out, things like the significance of having a view when you can find getting out difficult. So people's relationships with places. The natural world, relationships with the natural world, and people talking about finding it difficult to do the garden in the way they used to, so strategies for downsizing that by bringing plants inside and looking after them. So relationships with the natural world. And indirect as well as direct encounters with policymakers. I've talked about the significance of places and being able to be in public. This research was done in Brighton. I don't know how many of you know Brighton. You probably know it's a seaside town. And the seafront is a fabulous flat space where it's quite possible to be in a setting where there are lots of other people about and have those sort of, sense of being part of quite a busy place. Brighton is also an incredibly hilly town. And what people were talking about was the absence of bus services that actually enabled to get to that seafront where they could have that experience. So the significance of policy decisions that give those sorts of messages. Do people care about old people when they're making policy decisions about where to run the buses? That sort of thing. And the third thing is what I've called up there, renewing from an ethic of care. If you care about something, it means you want to make a difference. Usually, you want to make it better. Care isn't complete if you stop at attentiveness. And one of the ideas within care ethics has been the importance of this way of thinking and looking at things that is not just about offering a critique, but saying, so how would it look different if we started from an ethic of care? And so what we did in the final stage of this project was to bring together with members of our research team practitioners working in both statutory and voluntary social care agencies in order to translate research findings into learning resources for practitioners. This application of what we'd learned involved us in a new context in which we were bringing in people who were differently positioned in relation to old age and care together. And that required being aware of the dynamics and concerns that people were bringing to that. So in this instance, we were bringing in people whose job it was to do care practices or to manage care practices. And one of the things that we realised is that we had to be attentive to the context of their work and the discourses that they were operating with as well as questioning them. And what this is about is, this was a time when social care practitioners were saying actually the word care has largely been banished from our discourse. It's all about choice and control. And we were sort of saying to them, actually, no, it's not about choice and control. But we couldn't simply say, you're all wrong, this is rubbish. Well, what we had to do is to find ways of actually getting them to tell us how it might be possible to apply and rework some of what we'd learned in a way that made sense to them. And it was also, as part of this process, it was about validating personal inputs to these discussions as well as professional inputs. So, one of the points where we thought, okay, this is working, is when we've been talking about the significance of time in relation to care. And one of the social workers there sort of said, she said, what I've just realised is that when I go and see my father, I tend to start the visit by saying, can't stay long, just popping in. And you sort of thought, okay, she's got it. She's got it. So then, I've reached the point which I'm just going to conclude about the ethics of care. I've always thought that one of the jobs of academics is to try and offer people ways of thinking that might help them. There's no point in offering ways of thinking to people if it just doesn't connect in any way with their everyday experiences. One of the things that we did early in this project was sort of to do a seminar for our research team about care ethics, and they just sat there and nodded and said, yes, of course, yeah. So we thought, yes, this connects. This way of thinking, it connects. But it provides a particular language and a framework that people have found helpful to talk about things that can sometimes be invisible, that can be quite difficult to talk about. And our colleague B. Gagan from Age Concern, who worked with us on this, she said, I found this really, really helpful because although I come from an agency that talks about person-centred care all the time, I sometimes find myself struggling to really explain what I mean, what that means to me. And the fact that there is this body of work that has a sort of respectability and a grounding, in academic work gives me a sense that I can really make my point and be respected for it. The third point is about the inclusivity of care ethics, that it helps us overcome a sense that care is only something that is relevant to people who are regarded as needy. And it actually encourages us all to think about our roles and responsibilities in relation to care. So it can help us, get away from the reasons that disabled people were rejecting care because they thought it was making moral judgment about them. And the fourth point is that it can be transformative. This is not just coming in and saying, I want to offer a critical analysis, but I want to renew, I want to transform. And it can and does help us build solidarity. Thank you.